I never thought my life would get this complicated. I'm Evan, a 35-year-old software engineer, and if you had told me a few years ago that my biggest challenge wouldn't be work deadlines or coding bugs, but dealing with my in-laws, I wouldn't have believed you. But here we are. Let me take you back a bit. I'm married to Chloe, the love of my life. She's 33, a nurse, and honestly, the kindest person I've ever met. We've been together for 6 years, married for 3, and our life is simple but good. We have a modest home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where you know your neighbors but nobody bothers you too much. Our routines are pretty straightforward. Chloe works long, demanding shifts at the hospital, and I have my share of late nights coding and debugging software. But we make it work. We've always been a team, balancing each other out. She's the lighthearted optimist, I'm the calm, logical one. If it were just us, I think life would be perfect. But as with most things, there's a catch. Her parents, Harold and Diane. Let me tell you about them. Harold and Diane are intense, to put it lightly. They're wealthy, which they never let anyone forget, and they've always been overly involved in Chloe's life. From what I've seen, they have this need to control everything and everyone around them. Unfortunately, I've been on the receiving end of that more times than I can count. From day one, Harold and Diane made it clear they didn't think I was good enough for their daughter. Harold would comment on my job, calling it a hobby rather than a career, and Diane, well, she had this way of saying things that sounded polite but always had a sharp edge. Like, oh, Evan, it must be nice not to worry about work as much as Harold does. It was always little digs like that, never anything outright rude, but you knew what she meant. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself they didn't know me well enough yet. But over the years, it became obvious this wasn't about getting to know me. It was about control. They had this picture in their minds of the perfect man for Chloe, and I wasn't it. To them, I was too private, too reserved. They didn't like that I didn't overshare or jump through hoops to please them. They saw my boundaries as a flaw, not a strength. And Chloe, well, Chloe's always tried to keep the peace. She's loyal to me, no doubt about that, but standing up to her parents, that's not easy for her. They've always been this looming presence in her life, and I think part of her is still that little girl who wants their approval. I get it. I really do. But it's not always easy being the guy who has to smile and nod through Harold's condescending remarks or Diane's backhanded compliments. It's not easy knowing they think you're a mistake their daughter made, one they're waiting for her to correct. But here's the thing about me, I'm not one for drama. I've always believed that actions speak louder than words. So, I've kept my distance. I've been polite, respectful, but I've also drawn a line. I don't let Harold and Diane's opinions define me, and I've never let them dictate my relationship with Chloe. Still, their behavior started to weigh on me. The constant critiques, the intrusive questions, it was like they were looking for a reason to say, see, we were right about him. And the worst part, I think they wanted Chloe to doubt me too. Over time, I noticed Diane would ask Chloe these strange questions, things like, does Evan ever tell you where he's going? Or why does he work so late? At first, Chloe thought it was just her mom being nosy, but to me it felt like something more. Like they were fishing for something, some kind of flaw they could point to. I didn't say much about it at the time. I didn't want to create tension between Chloe and her parents. But it was hard not to feel like I was being watched, judged, and measured against some impossible standard. Despite all that, I focused on the life Chloe and I were building. I loved her, and I knew she loved me. That was enough, or at least I thought it was. Looking back now, I can see the signs were there. The subtle digs, the invasive questions, the way Harold and Diane always seemed to be waiting for me to slip up. I just didn't realize how far they'd go. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At this point, life was still manageable. Chloe and I were happy, despite the occasional frustrations with her parents. I figured I could handle the awkward family dinners, the passive-aggressive comments, and the disapproving looks. What I didn't know was that Harold and Diane weren't just judging me from a distance. They had plans that would turn our lives upside down. If living with Harold and Diane's constant judgments felt like walking on eggshells, the next chapter of our lives was like stepping into a minefield. It started subtly, as most things do. Harold and Diane had always criticized me, but lately they were turning up the heat. At every family gathering, Harold would find some way to bring up my job. Evan, he'd say, with that smirk of his, I heard the tech world is unstable. You sure that job of yours has a future? Diane wasn't much better. She had this way of pretending to compliment me while sneaking in an insult. You must love how flexible your job is, Evan. You know, Harold worked 12-hour days to provide for us, but I guess things are different for you. It wasn't just me they targeted anymore. They started making sly remarks about my family too. My parents aren't wealthy. They're retired teachers who worked hard their whole lives to give me a good start. But to Harold and Diane, that meant they were simple people who didn't have the same standards they did. Once, Diane even said, it's nice your parents live within their means, but don't you worry about their future? Chloe did her best to deflect their comments, but it was obvious she felt torn. I could see it in her face, the way she'd nervously laugh and change the subject. She hated the way her parents treated me, but she wasn't ready to confront them head on. And honestly, I didn't blame her. Harold and Diane weren't the kind of people who took criticism well. For a while, I managed to brush it off. I kept telling myself it didn't matter what they thought. But after a few months, their words started to stick. I'd catch myself replaying Harold's snide comments or Diane's thinly veiled digs late at night. It was like they were planting seeds of doubt, and I hated that it was getting to me. Then, things took a strange turn. I started noticing that Diane had a new hobby, asking Chloe weird questions about me. Does Evan ever tell you where he's going after work? She'd ask. Or, how come he doesn't talk about his friends much? Chloe would laugh it off, saying her mom was just being nosy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The questions got more specific over time. Diane asked if I ever seemed distracted or secretive. Once, she even asked Chloe if I was spending too much money. I mean, where was this coming from? I've always been upfront with Chloe and we share everything, bank accounts, schedules, even silly things like grocery lists. Still, I let it slide. Diane was nosy, sure, but I didn't think it was anything more than her usual meddling. Chloe assured me it was nothing, and I trusted her. But then came the night that changed everything. It was a Wednesday evening, and I was sitting in my home office finishing up some work when my phone buzzed. I glanced at it and saw a text from an unknown number. It said, "Are you still working late tonight?" I froze. My first thought was that it had to be a wrong number. But something about it didn't sit right with me. Who would know I was working late, and why would they care? I replied, "Who is this?" but never got an answer. The next morning, I told Chloe about the text. She agreed it was strange, but thought it was probably spam. I wanted to believe that too, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. Over the next few days, I started paying more attention to my surroundings. That's when I noticed the car. It was a silver sedan, parked down the street from our house. At first, I didn't think much of it. I decided I couldn't let this go. The next time I saw the car, I was going to confront whoever was inside. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to stop until I got them. What I didn't know was that this was just the beginning. The next evening, the silver sedan was back. This time I was ready. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. I grabbed my phone, took a deep breath, and walked out the front door. As I approached the car, my heart pounded in my chest. The window rolled down slightly, and a man in his 40s with a short beard and a baseball cap looked at me. He had the kind of face that screamed business, not someone casually waiting for a friend. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. The man hesitated, then sighed like he'd been caught. "Look," he said, "I'm just doing my job." That wasn't the answer I was expecting. "Your job?" I repeated. "What job involves sitting outside my house and taking pictures?" He glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm a private investigator," he admitted. "I was hired to gather information." My stomach dropped. "A private investigator?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Who hired you?" I demanded, my voice sharper now. He shifted uneasily in his seat. "A couple. Harold and Diane." Hearing their names confirmed what I'd suspected but didn't want to believe. My in-laws had hired someone to spy on me. I felt a surge of anger but forced myself to stay calm. "What exactly are you looking for?" I asked, crossing my arms. The investigator looked apologetic, but not enough to stop. "They said they wanted to make sure their daughter wasn't being lied to," he explained. "They seemed to think you were hiding something." I was stunned. Hiding something? What could I possibly be hiding? I worked, I came home, and I spent time with Chloe. That was my life. "You're wasting your time," I said, glaring at him. "I'm not hiding anything." The man shrugged. "I just do what I'm hired to do." Without another word, I turned and walked back to the house. My hands were shaking as I opened the door. Chloe was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, and looked up when I came in. "What happened?" she asked, seeing the look on my face. I sat down and told her everything. The car, the investigator, the fact that her parents had hired him to follow me. As I spoke, her face went pale. "They hired a private investigator?" she repeated, disbelief written all over her face. "Why would they do that?" "That's what I'd like to know," I said. "But according to him, they think I'm lying to you about something." Chloe grabbed her phone and dialed her mom's number without hesitation. I sat beside her as she paced the living room, the phone pressed to her ear. "Mom," she said when Diane picked up, "why did you hire a private investigator to spy on Evan?" I couldn't hear Diane's response, but judging by Chloe's expression, it wasn't good. "Are you serious?" Chloe said, her voice rising. "You had no right to do that." She listened for a moment, then turned to me and mouthed they admitted it. I could hear Harold's voice faintly in the background, and Chloe's face turned red with anger. "He hasn't done anything wrong," she shouted. "This is ridiculous." I watched as she argued with her parents, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. This was the woman I loved, standing up for me in a way I knew wasn't easy for her. After a few more heated words, she hung up and sat down beside me, visibly shaken. "They said they had a right to know if you were hiding something," she said, her voice trembling. "And my dad said, if there's nothing to hide, why does it matter?" I let out a bitter laugh. Of course he did. Chloe looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt. "Evan, I'm so sorry. I don't even know what to say." "This isn't your fault," I told her, even though I was furious. "But I'm not going to let them get away with this." I spent the next few days channeling my anger into action. If Harold and Diane wanted to scrutinize my life, I'd give them a front row seat. I started documenting everything. Every time I left the house, I logged where I was going and why. I kept receipts, took photos, and even used a timestamp app to prove where I was at any given moment. At first, it felt ridiculous. Who has to live their life like this? But the more I thought about it, the more determined I became. If they wanted to dig into my life, I'd hand them a mountain of proof that they were wrong about me. Chloe stood by me the whole time. She apologized over and over, but I told her she didn't need to. "This isn't about you," I said. "This is about them not respecting you, or me." Over the next week, I noticed the silver sedan wasn't around anymore. I guess the investigator had finished his job. Part of me wanted to confront Harold and Diane directly, but I decided to wait. I wanted to be prepared. If they were going to accuse me of something, I'd be ready to shut them down. I wasn't sure what their next move would be, but one thing was certain: I wasn't going to let them control my life. This was my marriage, my home, and my happiness. and if Harold and Diane wanted to fight, they'd pick the wrong person to mess with. A week later, I got the call I had been expecting, but it wasn't from Harold or Diane. It was the private investigator. "Mr. Evans," he said in a formal tone, "I thought you should know I've completed my report. Your in-laws requested a copy, but I can share the details with you as well if you're interested." I almost laughed. Interested. Of course I was interested. "Go ahead," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my patience was wearing thin. He began listing the details, and as he spoke, I couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and relief. The report was a collection of the most mundane aspects of my life: working late at the office, grocery shopping after work, stopping by a friend's house for a barbecue. Oh, and the grand finale, attending a bachelor party for one of my best friends. I was almost too stunned to respond. This was the big secret Harold and Diane were hoping to uncover. This was their evidence that I was somehow unworthy of their daughter? I asked for a copy of the report and thanked the investigator for his time. It wasn't his fault my in-laws were out of control, and besides, I had bigger things to worry about. When I told Chloe about the report, her jaw dropped. "A bachelor party?" she said, clearly irritated. "They're going to try to use that against you." "Apparently," I said. "Because, nothing says untrustworthy like hanging out with your friends for a night." We both knew what we had to do. It was time to confront Harold and Diane directly. But I wasn't going in unprepared. Over the next few days, I gathered every piece of evidence I could think of to prove how ridiculous their accusations were. First, I printed the investigator's report. Then, I pulled out receipts, photos, and even timestamps from my phone that showed exactly where I'd been and when. For the bachelor party, I had pictures of the group at a bowling alley, followed by dinner at a local restaurant. Nothing wild, nothing inappropriate, just a bunch of guys celebrating a friend's upcoming wedding. When everything was ready, Chloe and I invited Harold and Diane over for a family discussion. I could tell they were surprised by the invitation, but they agreed to come. Maybe they thought they'd finally caught me in some kind of lie. The day of the meeting, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. This wasn't just about clearing my name, it was about standing up for myself and my marriage. Harold and Diane arrived right on time, looking as composed as ever. Harold had that smug look on his face, like he was ready to deliver a lecture, and Diane was holding a folder which I assumed contained the investigator's report. Chloe and I greeted them politely, then led them to the living room. Once we were all seated, I took a deep breath and started. "I know why you're here," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. "You hired a private investigator to follow me, and now you think you've found something." Harold's smug expression faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly. "We had to," he said. "You've been secretive, Evan. We just wanted to make sure Chloe wasn't being lied to." I nodded, pulling out the investigator's report and holding it up. "This is what you found," I said. "My secret life. Working late, running errands, spending time with friends. This is what you thought was worth invading my privacy over." Diane looked uncomfortable, but Harold wasn't backing down. "What about the bachelor party?" he said. "That's not exactly responsible behavior for a married man." I couldn't help but laugh. "The bachelor party?" I said. "We went bowling, Harold. Bowling. And then we had dinner. Here are the photos and receipts to prove it." I handed him the evidence, watching as he reluctantly flipped through it. Diane glanced over his shoulder, her face growing redder by the second. Chloe, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "Do you hear yourselves?" she said, her voice shaking with anger. "You're accusing my husband of being dishonest because he went bowling with his friends? Do you realize how insane that sounds?" "Chloe, we were just looking out for you," Diane said, her voice trembling. "We didn't want you to get hurt." "Hurt?" Chloe snapped. "The only people hurting me right now are you and Dad. You don't respect my marriage, and you don't respect Evan. You've crossed every line." Harold tried to interrupt, but Chloe held up her hand. "No, Dad, you don't get to justify this. You invaded our privacy, you disrespected my husband, and for what? Because you can't stand the idea that I married someone you didn't choose." The room was silent for a moment. Then Harold spoke, his voice cold. Evan's lack of transparency forced our hand. If he had nothing to hide, this wouldn't have been necessary. I looked him straight in the eye. "Harold, I don't owe you transparency. My relationship is with Chloe, not you. And I've never hidden anything from her." Diane started to cry, but Harold just sat there, looking defiant. I knew then that there was no reasoning with him. After a tense silence, Chloe stood up. "If you can't apologize and respect my husband, then maybe we need some space," she said. "I won't let you ruin our marriage." Harold didn't respond, but Diane nodded through her tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though it didn't feel entirely sincere. As they left, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. This wasn't how I wanted things to go, but it was necessary. Chloe and I had drawn a line, and for the first time, I felt like we were truly on the same team. After Harold and Diane left our house, the tension didn't fade. It lingered, heavy and uncomfortable, like a storm that hadn't quite passed. Chloe and I sat together on the couch, quiet at first, processing everything that had just happened. Finally, she broke the silence. "Evan," she said softly, "I'm so sorry you had to go through this." I shook my head. "It's not your fault," I said. "But we can't keep letting them treat us like this. It's not just about me anymore. It's about us and our marriage." She nodded, her expression serious. "You're right. I've let them push too far for too long. That ends now." The next day, Chloe called her parents. I could hear her voice from the other room, calm but firm. She told them that unless they were willing to apologize, to truly take responsibility for what they'd done, she couldn't have them in her life the way they'd been before. At first, Diane tried to play the victim. "We were only trying to protect you," she said. "We had to make sure Evan wasn't hiding anything." "And what did you find?" Chloe shot back. "Nothing. because he wasn't hiding anything. You hired someone to spy on my husband for no reason. Do you know how humiliating that is for us? For me? Diane started to cry, but Chloe didn't back down. If you want to be in my life, you need to respect me and Evan. That means no more meddling, no more spying, and no more treating him like he's the enemy. Harold, of course, refused to apologize. I did what I thought was right, he said. If Evan has nothing to hide, he shouldn't care. Chloe's voice grew colder. Dad, this isn't about what you think is right. It's about boundaries, and you cross them. If you can't admit that, then maybe it's better if we take some space for a while. I could tell the conversation wasn't going anywhere, but I was proud of Chloe for standing her ground. When she hung up, she looked drained but resolute. I'm done trying to please them, she said. From now on, I'm focusing on us. For the next few weeks, Chloe kept her distance from her parents. She still talked to her mom occasionally, but the calls were short and superficial. With Harold, there was radio silence. At first, I thought this would give us a chance to heal and move forward, but Harold and Diane weren't done yet. One evening, Chloe's cousin Emily called her, sounding concerned. Hey, just so you know, she said, your dad's been talking to the family about you and Evan. He's saying some pretty nasty stuff. Chloe put the call on speaker so I could hear. What kind of stuff? She asked. Emily hesitated, then said, he's telling everyone that Evan is manipulative and controlling, that he's driving a wedge between you and your family. He even said Evan might be hiding something shady, like secret debts or gambling. I felt my stomach tighten.
Harold was trying to turn Chloe's family against me, and from the sound of it, he wasn't holding back. Emily, do people believe him? Chloe asked. Some do, Emily admitted. But honestly, most of us think it's just your dad being your dad. This isn't the first time he's done something like this. Remember what he said about Aunt Linda's husband? I glanced at Chloe, curious. What did he say about Aunt Linda's husband? Chloe sighed. He tried to convince the family that Uncle Roger was cheating on Aunt Linda because he saw him having lunch with a coworker. It wasn't true, but it caused a lot of drama before everything got cleared up. Emily added, your dad has a pattern of doing this. He doesn't like losing control, so he tries to make other people look bad. Most of us are onto him, but I just wanted to warn you in case it comes up. After the call ended, I sat there trying to process everything. Harold wasn't just targeting me, he was trying to manipulate Chloe's entire family. Do you think he'll stop? I asked Chloe. She shook her head. Probably not. But we can't let him win, Evan. We just have to focus on us and let the rest of the family see the truth for themselves.
It wasn't easy. Over the next few weeks, Harold's campaign against me continued. He called relatives, dropped hints at family gatherings, and even reached out to some of Chloe's friends. But something strange started to happen. The more he pushed, the more people began to question his motives. Chloe's uncle, who'd always been wary of Harold's behavior, reached out to us. I don't know what Harold's problem is, he said, but I've seen this before. He did the same thing to me years ago when I didn't do what he wanted. Don't let him get to you. Hearing that gave me some hope. Maybe Harold wasn't as untouchable as he thought.
Meanwhile, Chloe and I focused on rebuilding trust and moving forward. We started setting clear boundaries, not just with her parents, but with everyone in our lives. If someone couldn't respect our relationship, they didn't get a place in it. One night, as we sat on the couch together, Chloe leaned her head on my shoulder. I know this has been hard, she said, but I feel like we're stronger because of it. I'm not scared to stand up to them anymore. I kissed the top of her head, grateful for her strength. Me neither, I said. We've got each other, and that's what matters. Harold and Diane might have been trying to tear us apart, but all they'd done was bring us closer together. And as far as I was concerned, that was a victory they couldn't take away.
Just when I thought things couldn't get more complicated, life threw us an unexpected curveball. This time, it came from someone I never expected to hear from, Harold's brother, Robert. Robert wasn't someone we saw often. He lived out of state and only showed up at big family events. From what Chloe had told me, he and Harold didn't get along. I always assumed it was just sibling rivalry, but as it turned out, there was a lot more to the story. One evening, as Chloe and I were having dinner, my phone buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number, and normally I wouldn't have answered, but something told me to pick up. Evan? A calm, deep voice asked. Yes, this is Evan. Who's this? This is Robert, Harold's brother, he said. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I heard about what's been going on, and I wanted to talk to you and Chloe. I glanced at Chloe, who looked just as surprised as I felt. Sure, I said. What's this about? Robert sighed. It's about Harold and Diane. I think it's time you knew the full story. We arranged for a video call with Robert the next day. Chloe was curious but also hesitant. What do you think he wants to tell us? She asked. I don't know, I admitted. But if he's reaching out, it must be important. The next evening, Robert called, and we sat down together in front of the laptop. He looked older than I remembered, with graying hair and a serious expression. After some polite small talk, he got straight to the point. First, let me say that I'm sorry for what you're going through, he began. I know my brother, and I know how difficult he can be. This isn't the first time he's tried to control someone's life. Robert explained that Harold and Diane had a long history of meddling in other people's relationships. Years ago, they had interfered in Robert's marriage, going as far as spreading rumors about his wife to other family members. They thought she wasn't good enough for me, Robert said. They tried to convince me to leave her, even though we were happy. What happened? Chloe asked, her voice soft. I cut them off for a long time, Robert said. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way to protect my marriage. Harold has this need to control everything. If he doesn't get his way, he makes life miserable for everyone around him. Hearing this was both shocking and validating. It wasn't just us, they had done this before. And now, Robert was warning us because he didn't want history to repeat itself. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know the truth, Robert said. You're not the problem, Evan. Harold is. And the more you stand your ground, the more he'll push back. But you have to stay strong. He won't change, but you can set boundaries. After the call, Chloe and I sat in silence for a while, absorbing everything Robert had told us. I can't believe they've done this before, she said finally. It's like they've been playing the same game for years. It makes sense now, I said. This isn't about me. It's about Harold needing to be in control. Chloe nodded. But we're not going to let him win. As if Robert's warning wasn't enough, something else started happening around the same time. Word of the private investigator incident began to spread through Harold and Diane's social circle. Apparently, one of Diane's friends had heard about it and let it slip at a neighborhood gathering. At first, Harold and Diane tried to spin the story, claiming they had only hired the investigator because they were worried about Chloe. But not everyone bought their excuse. Who does that to their own son-in-law? One of Diane's longtime friends reportedly asked. That's just crossing the line. Slowly but surely, people began distancing themselves from Harold and Diane. Invitations to dinners and events became fewer, and some of their closest friends stopped returning their calls. It was clear that even their own peers thought they had gone too far. Chloe and I didn't take any joy in their social fallout, but it did feel like a small victory. For once, Harold and Diane were being held accountable for their actions. Through all of this, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come as a couple. Despite everything Harold and Diane had thrown at us, Chloe had stood by me, she had defended me, confronted her parents, and made it clear that our marriage was her priority. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I turned to her and said, I don't think I've ever told you how much it means to me that you've had my back through all of this. She smiled and reached for my hand. Of course I have. You're my husband, Evan. We're a team. And no matter what happens, I'm always going to choose us. Hearing her say that filled me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. For months, I had been consumed by anger and frustration, constantly trying to prove myself to Harold and Diane. But in that moment, I realized I didn't need their approval. Chloe's loyalty and love were all that mattered. As we sat there together, I felt a sense of vindication. Harold and Diane might never admit they were wrong, and they might never fully accept me. But I didn't need them to. I had everything I needed right there beside me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to relax. The battle wasn't over, but we were stronger than ever. And no matter what came next, I knew we could handle it together. After everything that had happened, I thought Harold and Diane would finally leave us alone. But, as it turns out, people like them don't let go of control so easily. About a month after Robert's call and the fallout in their social circle, Diane reached out. It wasn't in person or even face-to-face over a video call. Instead, it was a tearful phone call to Chloe. I overheard parts of it because Chloe put her mom on speaker, probably so I could hear her apology for myself. Chloe, I'm sorry, Diane said, her voice shaky and filled with emotion. I shouldn't have gone along with hiring the private investigator. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but your father insisted, and I just didn't stand up to him. Hearing her say that felt like a small victory, but it was also bittersweet. Diane wasn't apologizing because she truly regretted the harm she caused. She was apologizing because Harold's plan had backfired, and she was starting to feel the consequences. Chloe's response was measured but firm. Mom, I appreciate you saying that, but it's not enough. You've done this kind of thing before. Dad's been controlling, and you've always backed him up. It's not just about the PI, it's about years of disrespect. Diane began to cry harder, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then she said something that reminded me why we had set boundaries in the first place. You have to understand, she pleaded, everything we've done is because we love you. We just want the best for you. Chloe sighed. Mom, I love you too. But the best thing for me is to have a marriage built on trust and respect. And you and Dad need to understand that Evan is my husband. If you can't respect him, then we can't keep having this conversation. Diane promised to do better, but I wasn't convinced. Her apology was a start, but it felt incomplete, like she was still trying to justify her actions instead of fully owning up to them. As for Harold, he didn't even bother to call. He stayed silent, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. It was clear that he wasn't going to change, and Chloe and I had to accept that. Sometimes, the only way to protect your peace is to walk away, even if it means distancing yourself from family. In the weeks that followed, Chloe and I made a conscious effort to rebuild and refocus. We talked a lot about what had happened, not just the private investigator incident, but everything Harold and Diane had done over the years. We realized we needed tools to handle situations like this in the future, so we decided to see a counselor. It wasn't therapy in the traditional sense. We weren't going because our relationship was broken. We were going because we wanted to make it stronger. The counselor helped us set boundaries, communicate more effectively, and learn how to navigate difficult family dynamics. It was one of the best decisions we ever made. One thing the counselor said stuck with me: healthy boundaries aren't just about keeping people out, they're about creating space for the right people to come in. That's exactly what we started to do. We surrounded ourselves with people who respected us and supported our relationship, and we didn't waste energy on those who didn't. Over time, the hurt and frustration from Harold and Diane's actions began to fade. Chloe and I focused on the life we were building together, and we grew closer because of it. We didn't just survive the ordeal, we came out stronger. Looking back, I can't say I'm grateful for everything we went through, but I am grateful for the clarity it brought. Harold and Diane's behavior forced us to confront issues we might have ignored otherwise. It made us realize how important it is to stand up for ourselves and each other. Chloe's loyalty throughout this entire ordeal meant more to me than I can put into words. She didn't just defend me, she chose me. Time and time again, she made it clear that our marriage was her priority, even when it meant standing up to her own parents. As for me, I learned a lot about myself too. I learned that it's okay to draw a line in the sand, even if it means disappointing people. I learned that respect isn't something you can demand, it's something you earn by staying true to who you are. And most importantly, I learned that love is strongest when it's built on trust, communication, and mutual respect. Harold and Diane's actions may have caused a lot of pain, but they also gave Chloe and me an opportunity to prove just how strong our bond really is. And at the end of the day, that's what matters most. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything, I feel a sense of peace. Our lives aren't perfect, but they're ours. And no matter what challenges come our way, I know Chloe and I will face them together. Because when you strip away all the drama, all the noise, and all the outside opinions, what's left is the one thing that truly matters: love.